I recently went to Lyon, France, and saw a beautiful cathedral that had been built in the late 1800s. In the United States, that seems old, but next to the cathedral are some Roman ruins that were built in the 1st century BC. I could tell you all about what I saw in Lyon, but the purpose for my telling you isn't to convince you to go to Lyon. I wanted to start out with an example of the grammar I'm going to cover in this lesson. Both of my sentences contain relative clauses, and that's what we're here to learn about today. You can use relative clauses as subjects, objects, with prepositions, and with the word whose. I'm going to start out with subject-relative clauses. But first, let's talk about clauses. Do you know the difference between a clause and a phrase? A lot of people confuse these two, but they're not the same, and if you know what to look for, it's really pretty easy to tell them apart. A phrase is just a group of words that work together to make meaning. We have noun phrases and prepositional phrases. A clause is similar, but it has something that a phrase doesn't have. A clause has to have both a subject and a verb. Phrases do not have subjects and verbs. That's it. That's how you can tell phrases from clauses. You might say, hey, wait a minute. I thought a sentence is a group of words that has a subject and a verb. Well, you're right. They do. So you know what? Sentences are clauses. But clauses aren't always sentences. Today you're going to see some clauses that are not sentences. Let's get started with relative clauses that are used as subjects of sentences. If you have a sentence with a relative clause, you're going to have two clauses. The main clause, that's the one that can work as a sentence all by itself, and the dependent clause, which is the clause that can't be a sentence all by itself. I'll explain, but first let's start off by looking at what these subject-relative clauses look like. One way we make relative clauses is by putting them after the main clause. We want to talk about the man who owns a restaurant. We met him. If we want to tell you that information in one sentence, we're going to say, we met the man who owns a restaurant. This sentence has two clauses. The first one is, we met the man. That, of course, can be a sentence all by itself. We met the man. But we want to tell you which man we met, so we're going to say, we met the man who owns a restaurant. Who owns a restaurant is a clause. It has a subject, who, and a verb, owns, but it doesn't make any sense when we say, who owns a restaurant. Now, if there were a question mark at the end of this, it's kind of weird because we don't know which restaurant you're talking about, but grammatically speaking, it's a correct sentence. Of course, we have to change the intonation pattern. We can't just say, who owns a restaurant? That's how we say it when we put it with the main clause. For this clause to work as a question all by itself, we have to use the intonation pattern for a question. Who owns a restaurant? But that's not what we're trying to communicate. I'm trying to tell you that I met the man who owns a restaurant. In this sentence, the clause, who owns a restaurant, is a dependent clause, and it's the subject of the sentence. Who owns a restaurant is describing he. That's why it's the subject. He is the subject of the second sentence, and that's what this clause is replacing. So it's a subject-relative clause. Let's look at another one. The city was beautiful. It used to be the capital of Gaul. How can we put these two sentences together to make one sentence? Well, we're talking about the city. Actually, we're talking about Lyon. But we're also talking about the fact that Lyon, or the city, used to be the capital of Gaul. When we put these clauses together, we can say the city that used to be the capital of Gaul is beautiful. The city is the subject of the first clause, and it is the subject of the second clause. So that is what we use to replace it. Got it? Maybe some grammar rules will help make this clear. Rule number 1. A sentence with a relative clause combines two sentences or ideas. I should mention that we sometimes call these relative clauses adjective clauses because they describe nouns or pronouns. So I can say, I met the woman, she organized the meeting, or I can say, I met the woman who organized the meeting. Who organized the meeting is the relative clause. Rule number 2. A relative clause describes a noun or pronoun, and it usually comes after the noun or pronoun it describes. For example, the people that asked me about Mary have left. You can see that the clause that asked me about Mary is describing the people. People, of course, is a noun. Next, we welcome everyone who visits our store. The clause who visits our store describes everyone, which is a pronoun. Rule number 3. A subject relative clause begins with a relative pronoun. It could be that, which, or who. We use that or who for people, and that or which for places, things, and animals. For example, I know someone who lives in Japan. Many people that live here speak German. The iPad that's on the table is Jeff's, and the photos which show the Alps are amazing. Okay, rule number 4. In a subject relative clause, the relative pronoun is the subject of the clause. The relative pronoun is followed by a verb. And the examples are, I like the man who rented us the apartment. Who is the relative pronoun? He wants something that will remind him of his father. In this one, that is the relative pronoun. How are you doing? Am I going too fast? You can always pause the video to think about this or just stop it and come back after you take a break. As for me, I'm going to keep going. I have some more to tell you about the subject relative clauses. One thing that a lot of English learners have trouble with is something we call subject-verb agreement. This just means that if you're going to have a singular subject, you have to have a singular verb to go with it. The same, of course, is true of the plurals. So here are some rules about that. First, the verb in a subject-relative clause has to agree with the noun it describes. For example, I have a daughter who likes traveling. The relative clause is who likes traveling. The verb is likes, and it describes a daughter. Remember that verbs use an S when they're singular, and nouns use an S when they're plural. Don't get confused with this. But if I make this sentence plural, I have 2 daughters who like traveling. Now the noun is plural, so the verb no longer has that S, and that makes the verb plural. 2 daughters like. Next one, be careful with this one. The verb in the main clause always agrees with the subject of the main clause, like this. The map that shows the cities looks very old. The main clause is broken in 2, but if you take out the relative clause, the main clause is just, the map looks very old. But we're talking about which map, so don't get confused about which subject has to agree with which verb. The map is one, so the verb has to be looks, which is also singular. Last rule. Do not repeat the subject in a relative clause. So you can say, where's the article that tells about French history? But you can't say, where's the article that it tells about French history? Don't forget that the word that in a relative clause is actually a type of pronoun. It's a relative pronoun. We don't need another pronoun, okay?